So with redundancies, if you've got 20 or more people at risk of redundancy within a 90-day period, then there is a minimum consultation period, and that's 30 days. So what that means is you will need to go through consultation with employee representatives for a minimum of 30 days before you can serve the first notices to employees to terminate. In terms of when you're getting to greater numbers, so if you're at 100 at risk within 90 days, then you're going to have a 45-day minimum period of consultation. If you're under that, so if you're at 19 or less, then there's no minimum requirement. So you'll have to obviously make sure that your process is fair and objectively justified. If you don't have current employee representatives and you are caught by the collective consultation for 20 or more staff, you're going to have to go through a period of elections to find out who those employee representatives will be. Well, really, you need to go into a redundancy process considering that actually you're trying to avoid redundancies if you can at all costs. So maybe think about whether there's steps you can take before you even get to that point. And if there aren't, then maybe you need to think about revisiting that. You know, how else could you save money that would mean that you didn't need to make the redundancies? Because very often redundancies are driven by cost. If you've got to the point where you think actually we now need to make redundancies, there aren't any other alternatives, then it's a case of going to the staff and telling them that's what you're thinking about, and putting them on notice that that is something that you are having in mind. Once you've done that, you then need to think about where those redundancies might come from and who might be placed at risk of redundancy as a result. What's your pool of people? What roles is it that you're proposing you may not need anymore? And once you've done that, then you need to tell the staff who are affected. And if there's more than one, you might need to think about what selection criteria you're going to use and make sure that that's objective and can be demonstrated objectively as being fair. If you've used a criteria in the past, you might need to revisit whether that's still appropriate, and think about kind of, you know, how you're going to select those people for redundancy. Unfortunately, once you've decided that redundancies are necessary and you've identified the people who are now chosen for redundancy, you're going to need to meet with them again and make sure that they understand kind of the process and what that means for them. What is the proposed redundancy date? How much will they receive in compensation for losing their employment? There's statutory redundancy payments that have to be paid if someone's got more than 2 years service, and there's a formula that is applied to work out what that entitlement is. Are you going to ask them to work the notice period? Will that be paid in lieu? What will happen to other benefits if they are being paid in lieu? So you're having to think about speaking to the staff about how it will affect them and how you might mitigate the impact of the redundancy on them. So once you've decided that redundancies are something that you're going to have to do, and you've put people at risk, you need to be thinking about whether there are any alternatives to redundancy. So maybe, you know, short-time working, or even suitable alternative employment that might be available. And if you're going into a redundancy process, you need to be thinking about what that list of alternative vacancies might look like, because the whole point really of a redundancy process is to try and avoid redundancies. So if there are alternatives that you can offer to prevent a redundancy being made, then you really should be thinking about that. Well, I think if you've got a pool of bigger than just one person that you've identified as being at risk, then you are going to have to give some thought to what your criteria might be for selecting that person. What you need to be thinking about is, you know, how will you assess them? What will be the criteria? Performance, you know, might be an issue in terms of maybe a disciplinary record. If there are genuine performance issues, then they might have needed to be dealt with. But if that's being dealt with and become a disciplinary, then maybe you can use that. Length of service is okay. It shouldn't be the only criteria you use, but it is still acceptable. And then maybe skills and knowledge, a bit harder to judge objectively, but if you can demonstrate someone's got a qualification as opposed to someone else, then that might be something. So you need to really think about how you're going to judge everyone objectively in your selection process. The other thing to say is to make sure that you avoid anything that might be discriminatory. So attendance, if you use attendance, make sure that you're discounting any absences that are related to disability, or giving appropriate consideration to kind of how you should judge that in the process. It's fair to say that there are reasons that are automatically unfair if you choose someone for redundancy. So if someone's pregnant or on maternity leave, then that would be unfair to select them. And it's worth just throwing in there about pregnancy that if someone is on maternity leave, they're actually in a better position because they have the right to be offered a role in preference to anyone else if that's a suitable alternative role, because they are protected in that period. So don't forget that if you are dealing with anyone who is on maternity leave. Well, that is something that you can use if you have the right to do so in your contract of employment, or it's custom and practice in your sector. So don't fall into the trap of just assuming that you can put someone on short-time working or lay off. You need to double check the contract to make sure you've got the right. If you don't have the right, then you can only use those where you've got the consent of the employee. So it would mean going to the employee and asking them for consent to go on to short-time working or lay off. And the penalty obviously for not doing that is that the employee might resign and claim constructive dismissal if you haven't got a right to place them on short-time working or lay off. So starting point is the contract to make sure that you're able to do that.